first I'll give an overview of the study that we're doing. As Jeff said, a review of our review of the recession rate analysis that the Conservation Authority has been using to determine the setbacks. An outline of the Shoreline Management Plan update that we're doing, and next steps. So, just to summarize the background that you're all aware of. So the first Shoreline Management Plan that the Conservation Authority did was in 1994. It was updated in 2000 to reflect the provincial policy statement updates on natural hazards, which are the ones that Jeff just went through, the erosion, flood, and dynamic beach hazard. And then in 2016, you had the consultant's recommendation report where they looked at the Shoreline Management Plan and provided some recommendations for updating. And then last year, we started a process of re-engaging the public, and we updated the recommendations for shore protection and had a couple of public meetings in the summer. And so now here we are today, and we're continuing on with that process. So the objectives of the project that we're undertaking right now is to update the Shoreline Management Plan and to review and provide recommendations on the calculation of the average annual recession rate. And then there are 2 public open houses to present what we're doing and to get feedback from the public. And this is the schedule of the project. So we started with a data review. We've completed the recession rate review and provided it back to the Conservation Authority, and they've provided comments. So we've just we're just going back and forth a little bit to get it completely wrapped up. Develop the table of contents and outline for the Shoreline Management Plan, and then once that's agreed upon, we'll proceed with the draft and final report. So we've had a couple of meetings just on the phone with the Conservation Authority staff so far. We have this meeting today, and then we have another meeting at the end when the Shoreline Management Plan is when the draft is completed with you to present it to you, and we have the 2 meetings in the summer with the public. So I'll just go through our review of the recession rate analysis, and that's what the process that the Conservation Authority has used for determining the average annual recession rate, which is then used to determine the hazard limits, which Jeff was speaking about. So what we did was we reviewed the data sets and the methodologies that the Conservation Authority uses, and then we provided recommendations and also made recommendations for a defensible methodology that a property owner could use if they want to undertake a site-specific study to assess their own erosion rates. Generally speaking, there really shouldn't be much need for that, but I'll go through that. So the Conservation Authority has a number of different data sets that they've used and developed over the years in looking at the average annual recession rate. So the first data set was developed for the 2000 Shoreline Management Plan, and that was a comparison of the 1935 survey with the 1988 mapping, and that's what's been used up until quite recently. In 2016, the consultants did an update of that recession rate analysis, and they used the 1973 Shoreline Atlas and compared it with 2007 imagery. And then since then, the Conservation Authority has worked on that methodology and made some improvements to it. So we looked at all of the data sets and methodologies and came up with recommendations. So this shows just to give you an idea of the data that the 1935 survey has. This is the 1935 survey, and just sort of shows you what the geomatics people are working with. So this survey delineates the water line, the high water mark, and it assumes that the high water mark is the same as the toe of bluff, which in some places it is the same, but in other places there's quite a difference in it. So that's one of the issues that we found is that it can be off depending on the location you are. That you're looking at. Also, the transects are located, so there's a transect every 80 meters, and nowadays generally we would use a closer spacing for the transects that we take off. So this shows the toe of bluff line from the 35 survey and the points where you have data, and then the more recent data, and it just sort of shows you how the toe position can is not necessarily, straight lines like this. It sort of limits the data that you can take off, and how there can be a difference between the high water mark and the toe of bluff. So those are just some of the limitations on the old data sets that were used. Now I have to say that those were definitely the best data sets at the time when the 2000 plan was developed, and they're the same data sets that a number of other conservation authorities around have used. More data has obviously become available since that analysis was done. So the 2016 consultants report used the 1973 Shoreline Atlas data and compared it with the 2007 mapping. They compared the toe of bluff position again, just as had been done previously, and it's an easier feature to pick off is the top of bluff. So whereas the toe of bluff can be sort of a little bit less discrete, the top of bluff is usually generally easier to pick off, so we recommend that you can get a higher level of accuracy using the top of bluff than the toe of bluff. In this analysis, what was used was a 1973 atlas, and it's not the original air photos, so there was some distortion in the data. And then what happened is the bluff line that you pick off can be in a different position. So here's the toe of bluff taken from map sheet 75, and for the same location, here's the toe of bluff that you get if you take map sheet 76. So you can see the distance they are apart, and then this is the position in 2015. So you can see that there can be quite a significant amount of error in that, which the Conservation Authority has picked up and then looked at some ways of improving that analysis. So this is showing the same thing again, just looking on different map sheets how far off the line can be. So this red line is the same feature, but when you take it off from different map sheets, it's in a different position. And this also looks at, this is the atlas sheet, and then this is the actual photography, and you can see the difference in the clarity of the two of them. So then the Conservation Authority Geomatics Department looked at making some improvements to that. They used the same data sets in the sense that it was the 73 and the 2007 data sets, which gives you 34 years of comparison. Not quite as good as the old data sets that had from 1935 to 1988, I think it was. So not quite as long a period of comparison, but a better comparison, a more accurate comparison can be made. Our geomatics person reviewed the method that was being used. I don't want to get into too much detail, but provided some recommendations on the photo that you select, and making sure that when you're looking at a transect, it's located within the sort of middle of the photo where there's less distortion. So in general, the recommendations that we're making are that it's best practice generally to have the longest span between the two data sets that you can have. Use of the top of bank in the comparisons provides a better feature to pick off more accurately than use of the toe of bank. So we're recommending that because of the quality of the imagery and things, that the 73 to 2000 comparison is the better data set to use. And those new rates would supersede the previous rates from in the 1935 to 88 comparison. The Conservation Authority also has some ground surveys. There's not very many of them. I think there's about 5. But those can be used to validate the air photo comparison at the locations where you have them. So that's an extra piece of data that can be used and is very good to use. To reduce the distortion in the imagery, you use the central part of the images. That's what I just mentioned recently when you're taking off your transects. When budget permits, it would be very good to extend the period of comparison. So what has been used in the most recent comparison is 1973 compared with 2007. If the Conservation Authority has the budget and can extend that back to use the 1955 photos, that would provide you with an extra 18 years for the comparison. And the longer the duration of the comparison, the better. When new imagery becomes available, it would be worth looking at it and seeing if you can update it at the more recent end. So the most recent imagery that we're using is the 2007. There was imagery collected, I think, in 2015, but it's leaf on, and it's harder to pick off the top of bank feature. So maybe when new imagery comes available in, I don't know, 2019 or something, or 2020, then it's always good to reevaluate it, look at the quality of it, and see if you can extend your time of comparison. And then also just to take a look at the smoothing function, which is used in calculating the recession rate at any given point. So when they calculate the recession rate, they smooth it 100 meters on either side. And that's to take account of the accuracy of the comparison. There may be some small inaccuracies, but also the fact that the bluff along a section of shoreline with similar characteristics, it retreats at a consistent rate. But you might have a failure in one section, you know, maybe had a failure in 2015 in one section, and the adjacent area hasn't had a failure yet, but is due for a failure. So you need to look at something other than just the one property when you're looking at the recession rates. And then we also provide recommendations for a site-specific assessment if a property owner feels that they want to do a more detailed assessment of their property to come up with their own average annual recession rate, which I think has come up, you know, in the past. There's really not much reason that they should be doing that. The Conservation Authority has done a really good job looking for the best data and doing a professional analysis of the recession. But in the event that somebody does want to do their own comparison, then they would have to have additional data that extended the temporal range. So either they were maybe going back and getting the 1955 photo, or they've got a newer survey since 2007 that they want to use, right? The analysis must maintain or exceed the level of accuracy of the Conservation Authority's analysis. So you would need to get a geomatics or a survey professional to do that comparison. Normal property owner won't be able to do that on their own. So this is a little checklist that we're developing. So the duration of the comparison has to extend the temporal range. The average annual recession rate has to represent an unprotected shoreline. When you're doing a comparison of historical air photos, based on the technical guide, you want the natural recession rate. So if you've protected the shoreline for the last 30 years, then you're not going to be getting the average annual recession rate. The imagery or data must be georegistered. Geomatics or surveying professional must be used, and there would have to be some sort of a report outlining the quality control procedures. Then we have guidance on the scale of the survey or the photos. They have to be sufficient that you can actually do the comparison. And regional erosion rates need to be considered. So that's what I was saying earlier, that you can't just look at the one property, which may be due to fail in the next 3 years because the other properties around it have, but it's sort of sticking out. You can't just take that survey. So you need to look at the regional context as well. Okay, so that's it for the recession rate review that we did. And we've been going back and forth with Jeff and with Tracy on that, just to make sure that we understand everything that the CA had been doing or providing useful feedback. Looking at the Shoreline Management Plan update, we've just got a rough outline of it going right now, but we need to include documenting the processes that have been the historical development of the Shoreline Management Plan and the most recent efforts that the Conservation Authority has been taking to involve the public and make it a consultative process. We're going to include the documents that you already have developed as appendices to it, so the 2000 Shoreline Management Plan, 2016 Consultants Recommendation Report, and 2017 Shore Protection Recommendations that we did last year. Document policy changes that Jeff was just going through, some of the changes to the recommendations there, and the consistency with the provincial policy statement and the technical guide. So this just provides a sort of a brief outline of what will be in the Shoreline Management Plan, similar to your older shoreline management plans, but really just updating it. And next steps. So right now we're just about to start. We'll finish the outline of the Shoreline Management Plan, and then we'll develop the draft. It should be that'll be ready by the end of September, and then we'll get feedback on it and finalize it. We'll actually get more feedback as we're going through it. And we have the 2 public meetings in August that were just confirmed. And we'll present the Shoreline Management Plan to the board in October, tentatively. So that's it.
I do have a question. Could you move the slides back to your checklist?
Yep.
Correct?
Yep.
Okay, so my question is, box number 2, why would it not be important to have the information that tells us the effectiveness of protected shoreline and the results on erosion or on recession?
Generally, if you put shore protection in, you stop the shoreline from retreating while the nearshore lake bed continues to go down, right? So in terms of like the position of the bluff or whatever, you have a sort of, I would say, you know, it's not the natural shoreline erosion rate. What they're trying to get at is they're trying to define the hazard, right? So the definition of the erosion hazard is the stable slope allowance. So what slope, which is by default 3 to 1, the slope will attain to become stable, and then plus 100 times the average annual recession rate. So the recession rate that you use to calculate it is where the shoreline would naturally go back to. Now, some of the policies that Jeff has outlined address the potential to protect the shoreline in some ways, right? There are different ways of approaching that. Like, you know, some conservation authorities, the way that they approach their setbacks is they will say, okay, the hazard limit, well, the hazard limit you can't change. It's 100 times the average annual recession rate for an unprotected shoreline plus the stable slope allowance. And some conservation authorities will say, okay, if you put in shore protection, then the maximum life you can assign to it, which varies, let's just say it's 30 years. So your setback then, you have to be set back. They're giving you some credit for the shore protection. They're saying you have to be 100 minus the 30-year life of the structure, so 70 years times the average annual recession rate back. I think this conservation authority is taking a slightly different approach, Jeff.
For a new structure, it would be 60 years, but that again comes from the technical guidelines, not so much providing banking up time as a result of any shore protection. Mm-hmm. So, sorry, I'll stand up. Historically, this conservation authority has not permitted development to rely on or engineering solutions. So you can't engineer your way into a hazard area. Our position with shore protection has been that it has a very limited lifespan. There's no, it's very difficult to force people to maintain it. And as I outlined earlier, if your neighbors don't do it, I'm not convinced that your shore protection is really doing you a lot other than getting you a couple years. And to be quite frank, I think what it does is it helps people to sleep a little better at night, which is great. But it's not really stopping in the long term the recession. As Fiona was just outlining, the near shore area does continue to erode, and I think Dr. Robin Davidson-Arnott went through that quite a bit with the board. It continues to erode. I think, and Fiona can help me here, when that shoreline protection fails, and it's going to fail, it has a very limited lifespan, I think the shore, the bluff, plays catch up. So it erodes faster than it would have in order to account for the lack of erosion that it's had because the nearshore area is deeper. I don't know, is that true?
Yeah, like in the long run, it's a temporary solution when you put shore protection in. I agree with what Jeff said. But the reason that you have to use the unprotected shoreline is because you're trying to assess the hazard. And the hazard doesn't recognize shore protection because, as Jeff said, who knows if the person that's living there 50 years from now is going to put in some shore protection, which is just going to delay the erosion. So what they're interested in is the unprotected natural erosion rate.
And that is a provincial guideline.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you both.
Thank you.
We're at the question point. Board, any questions for Fiona?
Through your
Yes,
George,
Dave.
says Fiona, you did talk about the ARR has changed from what we had before. And
It probably will be adjusted. I haven't actually looked at your numbers, Jeff, and I don't think you've completed going through that, have you?
We are continuing to review the numbers, and that's why those maps that I showed earlier were with a lot of caution about. But we are considering to look at it, or sorry, we are continuing to look at it. The information, Tracy continues to work with the information that we're getting. We're also looking at the recommendations that Baird has provided to us, and we'll be in a position to provide the board with recommendations probably next month as to what Baird is providing us, and staff giving you recommendations as to what to accept in terms of the average annual recession rate. So I don't want to presume, I hope I've answered your question. Yeah. The average annual recession rate, I'm not sure it's really changed.
okay.
What's changing is our ability to be more precise to determine what that average annual recession rate is.
Jay?
Yes, I mentioned to Jeff earlier, but I was just down at the Great Lakes St. Lawrence City's Initiative conference. They did talk about climate change, and the level of Great Lakes historically has been plus or minus 3 feet of normal. Their projections at that conference was that will change to plus or minus 5 feet.
So they're saying more variability.
And I just wondered whether,
Yeah,
obviously
so
that won't be in the recession rates going forward. I mean, there'll be longer periods where there isn't, erosion of the bluff, but there'll be more rapid in the high water marks.
Well, depending on which predictions you look at, you get different, different guidance on that. So, when they first started looking at this, everybody was saying, oh, the lakes are going to go down because of more evaporation. But now they're also predicting that there's going to be more intense storms. And the other issue along your shoreline is ice cover. So, historically, what's happened is there's ice along the shoreline in the winter months, and that's when you also have your biggest storms. So during that period, the ice actually protects the shoreline. But when you don't have as much ice cover, there's a lot less ice. If you look back at the historical ice cover charts, you'll see that there was historically a longer period of ice coverage on the lakes. And so the shoreline is no longer protected by that ice as much as it was. So that can result in more erosion of the shoreline. I think at this point right now, we don't have enough information that would allow us to change the erosion rates. I think we just have to be aware of the potential impacts of climate change and always keeping up to date on what the guidance is on that. And that there is a higher level of uncertainty therefore, and so really you should be more cautious. You should be aware of climate change impacts are coming, and should be cautious. Yeah.
Thanks, Jim. Jeff?
Do you mind if I just add to that? Sorry, I agree 100% with Fiona with regards to what she said, and I don't want to presume what Baird is going to be ultimately providing to the authority in terms of recommendations and so forth. But I think it may be fair to presume that Baird will recommend that we not go 20 years or however 18 years in between review of our Shoreline Management Plan. And I think, with the techniques in terms of remote sensing and the information we have right now, it becomes easier and easier to recalculate recession rates. And if we are reviewing our Shoreline Management Plan on a little more consistent basis, maybe every 5 years or so, and then the average annual recession rate a little more, maybe not every year, but maybe every 7 years or 7.5, I think we'll start to identify some of the concerns as a result of climate change. I would agree. I'm hearing also that we should, quite frankly, expect more erosion than we have been in the past because of the variability of the lake and the loss of the ice coverage. So, absolutely.
Thank you. Any further questions? Thanks, Fiona.